Welcome to the Animal Training Academy podcast show. I'm your host, Ryan Carledge. I know that you're here because you want to master your animal training skills using a force-free approach. And to handle the variety of challenges you face, you need a broad knowledge and experience base. The problem is, we all get stuck and hit rough patches in our training, which can leave us feeling overwhelmed and helpless. Our mission since 2015 is to empower trainers just like you. The Animal Training Academy has helped thousands of trainers globally to develop skills, gain confidence, and positively influence both animal and human learners. Here's how we can do the same for you. Sign up for our membership waitlist at www.atamember.com. Register when our doors open email arrives and start growing your training skills. Build impactful training practices benefiting you and those you train. So join the waitlist at www.atamember.com. And while waiting, enjoy this free podcast show. We want to see you avoid embarrassment, overwhelm, and burnout. Instead, we want to see you build resilience to setbacks, get more organized, and grow your training skills and knowledge. In short, we want to see you enjoy confidence in yourself as a trainer and lead a fulfilling life, positively impacting the lives of the animal and human learners you work with. But we will start today's episode where I'm very excited to welcome back to the ATA podcast show, Jessica Dolce. Now, if you haven't listened to the first part of our conversation, you can find it in the previous episode on whatever app you're listening to the show on. And that episode, we explored Jessica's journey in getting started in her work and what led to her current role in supporting the well-being of animal welfare professionals. And we took a little bit of a deep dive into compassion fatigue and some ideas about things you can implement if you are struggling with some of the things we talked about in that episode. It's definitely worth a listen. However, if you haven't listened to it yet, you're of course totally welcome to start here with part 2, where you'll still gain plenty of insights to help you grow your skills, knowledge, and confidence. So let's dive in. Jessica is a certified compassion fatigue educator, receiving her training from Tend Academy. She brings decades of experience working with and for animals to the Compassion and Balance program, her online education platform, supporting the well-being of animal welfare professionals. Jessica is an instructor at the Shelter Medicine program at the University of Florida and has worked with organizations worldwide such as the IAABC, National Wildlife Rehabilitators Association, 2 Green Threads, HSUS, Animals Asia, and the ASPCA. Jessica holds a Master of Science in Adult and Higher Education and certificates in mindfulness facilitation, positive psychology coaching, and mental health first aid. She lives in Maine with her husband, dog, cats, and ducks. So without further ado, it's my very great pleasure to welcome Jessica back to the show today. Jessica, thank you for taking even more time to come and hang out with us at Animal Training Academy. And thank you to your husband as well for being nice and quiet while we record.
Thank you for having me back. I'm grateful to have this chance to talk with you more. And yes, a shout out to all the roommates and spouses and partners out there who are quietly trying to live their lives while their other half records podcasts.
Well, I think in part 1, I could have just kept going and going and going and talking and asking questions and going down rabbit holes. But alas, we had to wrap up. But I'm excited to tackle a subject in this part 2 that resonates deeply with all of us in the animal care and training profession. And that's redefining success for burnout prevention. Jess, as animal care professionals, we're all driven by a profound compassion and commitment to the welfare of our learners, both our animals and our humans. We literally pour our hearts and souls into our work, often setting incredibly high standards for ourselves. And while of course this dedication is commendable, it can sometimes lead us down a path where our own well-being takes a backseat, leading to overwhelm, stress, and the looming shadow of burnout. But today we're going to talk about how to redefine our measure of success in a way that embraces both our professional aspirations and our personal well-being. To explore this crucial topic, I'm thrilled to have you with us today, Jessica. You're an ideal subject matter expert to lead us through this conversation. But before we get started, I just want to seek a definition from you, if I may. When we say burnout in this context, can you define for the listeners of this show what we mean?
So the definition that I tend to use is the one from the World Health Organization. And so I'll just give you their straight definition. It's a syndrome conceptualized as resulting from chronic workplace stress that has not been successfully managed. It is characterized by three dimensions. So feelings of energy depletion or exhaustion, increased mental distance from one's job, or feelings of negativity or cynicism related to your job, and reduced professional efficacy. And so, what's important here is that burnout is referring specifically to your occupation, your relationship with the work, and how that's impacting you. So, burnout stems from really working conditions and how you're relating to working conditions. And the reason why that's important to say is compassion fatigue or empathy fatigue is stemming from the type of work that you are doing, where you are empathetically engaged with animals or people who are stressed or suffering or traumatized and in need of your skilled care. So they're really two different things in the sense that helping professionals, may experience compassion fatigue because of the nature of the work that they're doing. Burnout is something that anyone can experience. It does not matter what type of work that you're doing. So you can drive a bus and experience burnout, or be a lawyer, or work at a bank, or be a dog trainer. And it's really, I think, important to understand that burnout is not just about too much stress or feeling just exhausted. Burnout is all of those things, that exhaustion, that lack of, reduced feeling of professional efficacy, that cynicism or detachment mentally. It's all of those things. And one way I think that was helpful for me of understanding burnout is that yes, it is stress. It's prolonged stress with the sense that there's too much for you to do and you don't have enough support or control or resources to cope with those demands. So if the demands are really high, but you feel like you have the resources to cope with those demands, you may not burn out, even though the demands are pretty high. It's the sense that there's a huge amount of demand and I do not have what I need to cope with that. And if you're working in an organization, then it's important to be looking at organizational factors, working conditions. So if anyone is in an organization versus being self-employed, it's really important that your leadership and you understand that burnout is a working condition issue, not a individual worker issue. If your staff is burning out, there's a problem in terms of your working conditions. And so typically the 5 top causes of burnout in a workplace are unfair treatment at work, unmanageable workload, a lack of role clarity, lack of communication or support from your manager, and unreasonable time pressure. Can also include like a mismatch in your values with the organization or your role. And so those are things that we need leadership and organizations to address. If you have a burnout problem at your organization, you need to look at your responsibility as someone in a leadership role. That doesn't mean that there aren't things that you can do as an employee to help yourself, but it's just important that we don't put the blame or responsibility on the individual when the working conditions are a big part of the problem. If you're self-employed, you're the boss. And so that was why last time we talked a little bit about my history as a self-employed dog walker, and I'm self-employed now. So I deeply, deeply understand what it is to be your own boss and to burn out, because I've definitely experienced that as someone who is self-employed. So many of us are experiencing an overlap of both, whether we're in an organization as a helping professional. We might be experiencing some compassion fatigue and burnout. Same thing if you're self-employed, depending on the type of work that you're doing, it might be both compassion fatigue and burnout. But there are things that we can do on our own to kind of adjust, the way that we are relating to the working conditions that either we have created or someone else has, that can reduce our experience of burnout. And certainly if you're self-employed, there are changes you can make in the working conditions to help yourself.
And the definition from the World Health Organization, is that one that they've come up with, or is that, because like we talked about in the part one, there is a ton of research around compassion fatigue, but we talked about there not being agreed upon definition.
Yeah,
there
burnout is much more clear. So much more. So the World Health Organization,
cool.
That is their definition. Yeah, and compassion fatigue there's just so much debate around terminology in that regard. Burnout is a much, much clearer definition. And it is a workplace. It's an occupational phenomena. It's not just about like I'm burned out about all the chores I have to do at home. Like this is specific and related to your working conditions, stemming from those interactions you have with work. And what I mean by how it can happen to anybody, not just helping professionals, is that like contributors to burnout are things like low pay, long hours, endless meetings, not feeling appreciated. I always think about how there's a whole genre of like comedy around bad office jobs. Like we all know those conditions from The Office or like Dilbert cartoons or whatever. And so those working conditions the demands are high, there's not enough support or control or resources, is a problem for many, many people in lots of different industries. And so it's not necessarily because of the type of work that you're doing. That being said, because a lot of you are probably very empathetically invested and engaged with the animals and people in your care, that may be contributing to empathy fatigue, which is certainly going to make you more vulnerable to burnout, and drive some of the ways that we work. Empathy fatigue can kind of shape the way we behave at work, that then can lead to more burnout. And what I mean by that is often in the early stages of empathy fatigue, we start to hustle harder and work more as a way to try to cope with the empathetic distress that we're experiencing. So we take on more and more responsibility. That's me starting a nonprofit on the side of the job, right? I was feeling empathetic distress around the pit bulls in my care. So let me start an entire new project, right? And so often in the beginning stages, there's a real fire under us and we're working more and more. So it's stress, absolutely, but we feel like we have the activation to meet those demands still. We're fired up, we're trying to take it on. And in some ways, we're trying to kind of outrun some of the empathic distress that we're experiencing. It's usually over time, as empathy fatigue or compassion fatigue progresses, that we start to kind of check out and get really numb and apathetic and kind of phoning it in. But my point in bringing empathy fatigue back up is that some of those early stages of empathy fatigue, we lose all of our boundaries with work as we try to kind of out hustle the suffering. And that absolutely, regardless of what your working conditions are, that change in the way that you are working, it will likely start to contribute to putting you on the burnout spectrum. So again, it's complicated.
It's complicated, but also relatable, because everyone listening to this show, I assume everyone listening to this show is an Earthling. If you're not from Earth, thank you for listening. And is experiencing
Please contact us.
But you won't find Jess on social media, so go to her website. But
Call me.
the so I- the my thoughts are all over the place, as you can tell from my stuttering and jumping between sentences. Thinking back to the World Health Organization definition, can you repeat that? Because I cannot repeat it to you. I'd love to be able
Yeah.
to, but I need another.
I have to read it. I can't repeat it either. I have no
Cool.
memory for definitions. So their definition is that burnout is a syndrome conceptualized as resulting from chronic workplace stress that has not been successfully managed, characterized by three dimensions: feelings of energy depletion or exhaustion, increased mental distance from one's job, or feelings of negativity or cynicism related to your job, and reduced professional efficacy. And they go on to say burnout refers specifically to phenomena in the occupational context and should not be applied to describe experiences in other areas of life. That's end quote. And that's meaning that this is a occupation. This is like an occupational hazard. It's related to your work. It's not the same as a mental health condition like depression or anxiety. This is linked to your job and the way that you're working or your working conditions. The other part that's important is it's all three of those things. It's not just exhaustion, right? It's exhaustion and mental distance and reduced professional efficacy. And so when I said burnout spectrum or continuum, what I meant by that is you might get on the kind of that exhaustion end of things, but you're technically not burned out because maybe you're not feeling really negative. You're just tired, right? So like you're not burned out, but you're experiencing the exhaustion part of things. And then it's once you're feeling all three of those significantly, that's when we're really looking at burnout.
And I've always said that I burnt out. Now my mind's trying to fit my experience into that definition, which I'm not sure is helpful or not helpful.
Something that was helpful for me is that reduced professional efficacy bit, which is kind of like, I don't know, I can't really relate to those words. What does that mean? Something that was helpful for me is this idea of you start to feel like nothing you're doing is making a difference. And maybe you're not even good at your job and you should quit. So when I worked in an animal shelter early on, there was a sense of no matter how hard I try, I can't seem to make things work here. So, it was a sense that it was the job itself. Like I just can't make anything positive happen. But after a while, it started to feel like, am I even meant to be here? Maybe I'm terrible at this. Maybe I should leave. So it is this kind of sense of, kind of helplessness and hopelessness that you're not able to do your job well, maybe because of working conditions. And then to some extent, it starts to become internalized like, oh, I might be really bad at this. Maybe I should quit being a veterinarian, a dog trainer, or whatever. And you start to really question like professionally if you're on the right track. So I think people who have experienced a lot of burnout, and the way I think about it is I know I'm on the path to burnout when I start browsing local job listings to see if libraries have any openings. That's my tell. When I want to just go hang out with books professionally, I know that we're looking at burnout. Like I might not be there yet, but that's my tell because I'm starting to think I need to just quit this altogether. I'm not meant to be doing this. I'm no good at it. Nothing I do matters or makes a difference professionally. I think it's time for me to go hang out in a library full time. So maybe someone can relate to that part.
What some dots I'm connecting right in this very moment, just based on what you've just said, is firstly, I have a lot of towels that help me identify that the potential for the symptoms, the behaviors, the observable behaviors that result from what I label as burnout, that I'm at risk of getting to those behaviors, which are, I'm not going to go there because I don't have the words to quickly articulate that on a podcast episode. I don't want to put our listeners through that. Maybe we'll come back to it. But it's made me think that in part one, we talked about if you have empathy fatigue, it's important for you to restore yourself. And you need to restore yourself to continue to be empathetic. And I've been applying that to, but in a different frame, applying it to prevent burnout, which just hold I think we're on the same page here, which doesn't make sense based off what you said, because it doesn't. I get restored, but then I re-enter an ineffective work environment because I'm learning how to run a company.
Yes. So here's the helpful bit, because there's so much overlap, and like exhausted is exhausted. Symptoms of compassion fatigue include cynicism and negativity and hopelessness and helplessness, huge amounts of overlap in terms of some of the symptoms. What then becomes helpful is looking at the sources of stress and distress. So if you are stressed by this empathetic connection, maybe the grief that you are experiencing, losses, potentially trauma exposure, if that's part of your job, maybe we're looking at empathy fatigue or secondary traumatic stress as the outcome of those stressors and contributing factors. If it's working conditions that are leading to the outcome of burnout, like it just helps us to see the difference. So if you're looking at, I haven't taken a vacation in years, I never feel like what I do is good enough, I'm a perfectionist, I expect too much of myself. Like if you're self-employed or if you're employed by someone else, I get no support or appreciation, I'm working an outrageous, unreasonable workload for one person. Like those working conditions, if that is the source of your stress and distress, that is ultimately probably taking you down the road to burnout versus empathy fatigue or secondary traumatic stress. Does that make sense? So most of us have, I think, a little bit of both, or a lot of us do. It's not uncommon for us to have both, for there to be overlap, for one to be feeding the other. But if we're kind of struggling with, do I have burnout or do I have empathy fatigue? Go back to the sources of your stress and distress. And that can give you some clues about what you might be experiencing right now. And ultimately, you might be experiencing both. But when you are kind of going into a workplace or you're building a business and it's the sheer volume of work and the overwhelm that comes with it, we're probably looking at burnout, even if there is some empathetic distress mixed in there. Does that make sense?
I don't know if it makes sense, but I can tell you what I'm thinking and you can tell me if I am on the same page.
I'll take it.
It's making me think that, well, firstly, let's back up just a little bit. The topic we're going to talk about today is redefining success for burnout prevention. And we just talked about restoring yourself so I can go do my hobby. For me, it's literally just gardening at home, but getting my hands dirty, being physical, being on my feet, not parenting, not running a business, not looking after our pets, just mowing the lawns or trimming some hedges or doing some mulching, whatever it is. That energizes me. And I'm back at work, but potentially I'm back in an ineffective system. However, the topic of this episode is redefining success. And a dot that's been connected for me is I'm like, as you're talking, thinking, why am I going back into an ineffective system? It's because I have tools and I've learnt tools over the last few years. However, I think that my goalpost is always shifting. So I'm coming back into an ineffective system going, it is ineffective, but I know that I'm working towards this thing. And when I get there, it'll be effective. But then when I get there, I'm like, the goalpost has already moved.
Yeah.
Which brings it back to this redefining success part. So you and I talked a lot about pre-Christmas, what exactly we wanted to talk about in this episode. And we landed on redefining success for burnout prevention. So bounce off what I've just thrown at you to test if I understood what you were saying and to tie it back into this concept of we can prevent, bear with me, we can prevent the syndrome of conceptualized of we can prevent the syndrome conceptualized from chronic workplace stress that has not been successfully managed, which leads to energy depletion, increased mental distance from one's job, cynicism related and reduced professional efficiency.
Efficacy.
We can prevent that from happening by redefining success.
That would be one part of it for sure.
Right.
Yeah. I will say again, if you're working in toxic working conditions, Like there is a point where individual efforts to shift your mindset or redefine success will not protect you from truly toxic workplace conditions. So I just always want to be careful about not about making sure that organizations are held responsible for their end of the bargain. But let's for now say that the conditions you work in are just average and or you are self-employed. Your ability to redefine success is going to have a big impact on how you feel at the end of the day and whether or not you feel energized, demoralized, that you have a sense of professional efficacy can be very much adjusted by how you are defining success to start with. So your example of I'm working in this ineffective system and I'm okay with it because I have tools to cope. I'm coming in with the sense of I'm going to make it a more effective place. And then you reach a goalpost, but then you see the next one. So there's no real sense of success. It's just, man, there's a million more changes I have to make. Is that kind of what you're saying? Or do you feel like you are able to define meeting that goal as a success for yourself?
Yeah, well, two things. Firstly, make sure that it is valuable for the listener. So I think the thing the listener struggles with, based on what we see in our academy and what our members are talking about, is they struggle to feel success just on a daily basis or a weekly basis. I think that question of am I good enough to be a dog trainer is really the main problem that we solve here at Animal Training Academy, is teaching people that they are good enough, giving them confidence to be trainers. So speaking on my opinion about the listeners of this show and what we see in our academy, I think it's that just always questioning, are they good enough?
Right, which is definitely going to make burnout more likely. If you never feel like your work is good enough, if you always feel inadequate, incompetent, if you are putting really unreasonable demands on yourself, or you're expecting like too much of yourself as an individual, these are all things that are going to increase your likelihood of experiencing burnout, whether you are self-employed or you work in an organization. So that's the part where it is really important that we take some ownership over what is good enough, right? Because to me, that's another way of saying success. Like I rarely use the word success, but I every day think in terms of what is good enough. And so I think it's really critical that we take the definition that we define for ourselves what success or good enough looks like with and not depend on an external definition from our organization, from our clients, from our culture to tell us whether or not we have done enough or are good enough or have succeeded for the day. Right? Is that what we're getting at?
Yeah, well, I think it makes me think of a saying. I don't know who said it, so I can't give credit. But the saying is something along the lines of perfection is the enemy of good enough and good enough gets results. And that's been my mantra for a long time.
Yeah.
I don't know how that sits with others though. And I worry that it doesn't sit well with others because people are striving for perfection.
And perfectionism is a driver of burnout because you can't be perfect. So if perfect is your definition of success, you will never succeed. So you put yourself in a real pickle if you are striving for perfection. It's not possible. And that's also, related to your sense of, how powerful do you think that you are, particularly when you're working with other living beings? Like you have very limited control over the outcomes of your work with other people and animals. What you have control over, and therefore what I believe you should define success by, is how you show up to do the work. And the outcome, you contribute to it, but you ultimately don't have full control over it because another human being is involved, an animal is involved with genetics and nature and nurture and environment and pandemics and luck and weather and all, like there's all of these things contributing to the ultimate outcome. And if if the outcome alone is how you define success, and the outcome often won't be what you hope for, then you're setting yourself up to always feel like you're failing or not good enough. It's really important that we figure out other ways to define whether we're doing a good enough job or we're succeeding, looking at what we have control over so that we can feel some sense of satisfaction and efficacy and accomplishment at the end of the day, no matter what the outcomes of those efforts might be. And I can hear someone out there who's going, okay, fine, but good enough, the way I show up to do the process, I want that to be perfect, right? Not even the outcome, just the process needs to be perfect. And I think I would just say to that you're not a machine, you're an animal. And so you're never going to be perfect. And if you're not able to accept good enough, a B plus, whatever your grading system is, if you're not able to accept good enough, that's your choice, but you will continue on the path to burnout if you hold yourself to perfection as your standard of success and how you show up every day for your clients or that people and animals that you're working with. It's not really a realistic way of doing complicated work. Right? We have to offer ourselves more grace and wiggle room than that. And so that defining of what is good enough, like that's subjective for each of us. But we do have to figure out the parts that we have control over and how we want to define success so that we can feel that we've done enough and are satisfied and can rest. So we don't have to keep doing more and more and more to prove to ourselves, that we're good enough because we've already decided that we are by meeting certain conditions or definitions. How's that landing?
Yeah, it's making me think all of the things. But one of the things that is making me think is
all of the things.
I literally just thought every single thought that could be thought. But
his head actually exploded, everybody.
This is AI Ryan talking now. I don't exist. It made me think about the growth mindset and Carol Dweck and showing up with the barometer, is that the correct word here? That your goal is to be a learner. And so as long as you learn, then you are successful at the end of the day. And we're always learning. And we know this because we teach dogs and horses and cats and birds and exotic animals all day using this science. So it's like flipping the coin and putting it on yourself. It's connecting some dots for me in terms of the difference between how you show up and the outcomes. However, the very real life impacting results, consequences of how you show up. If you burn out in your business, then how do you support your family? And so there's pressure there. And then, but the other dot that kind of sitting out there is in space somewhere and trying to find its way in here is the decision fatigue that comes with this process. So I can show up and I can be a good learner, but whatever I decide right now I'm going to learn. I'm going to be successful because I'm going to learn. That's guaranteed. But if I make this decision, the outcome could significantly impact me. And so the weight of that decision now becomes a contributor. But I don't know if this relates to success or not. Like, does it?
I think this is where that concept that I mentioned when we talked before Christmas about the conditions of enoughness comes in handy. And so let me define it and then tell you how I use it. And you can tell me if it might be a useful tool in the scenario you just described. So conditions of enoughness is something that was created by a writer and coach named Jennifer Loudon. And I have adapted it where I use it for myself. I used to use it with my coaching clients all the time. And the idea is that we take a part of our life that is challenging, overwhelming, our jobs, right? The way that we're showing up all the time. And we decide what our conditions are for us to feel like we've done enough. And we decide that ahead of time. So we're declaring what we need to do in order to feel satisfied. And it has to be something pretty simple and measurable and either time defined or there's a frequency. We're getting real specific. It's something that only is dependent only on you. It's something you have full control over. So no one else has to change anything that they're doing. This is a condition would be something that of enoughness is you're responsible for it. And that if you meet this condition, you have to declare yourself good enough or success if you have met it, even if initially that doesn't feel like success for you. So an example I use a lot is, and I use conditions of enoughness all the time when I'm doing in-person speaking gigs. So I work mostly online, but occasionally I go into organizations and do workshops. And in the beginning, I was fine in terms of, I was a good speaker and educator, but I wasn't so great at like managing the group dynamics, which can get really heated around issues of stress in the workplace. And so some people would say some really harmful things to their coworkers. People would start crying. There was a lot of big emotions in the room, and I would get kind of overwhelmed and I was not handling it in a very skillful way. And so I always left feeling like I had failed, that I hadn't succeeded, even though I don't know that that was the perception from the participants, but that's how it felt for me. And so I started using conditions of enoughness, where before an in-person workshop, I would pick 3 things that if I did those 3 things, then I would declare myself good enough, a success. And those 3 things were stuff I had full control over. So one condition was that I prepared adequately, that I had time to rehearse or practice my slides or whatever it might be. The next condition would be that if things got heated, if people were escalated, that I would name what was happening and that I would ask for a pause and that I would suggest a self-regulation practice that we could all do together. Self-regulation meaning like grounding, breath work, which are all part of my workshop anyway. And that I would also allow myself to slow things down internally so that I would do some deep breathing, that I would allow myself a little extra time to respond thoughtfully instead of trying to jump in to react. And so if I did those 3 things, I prepared adequately, if things got heated, I named it and I suggested some self-regulation. And essentially I was like self-compassionate and kind to myself in the moment and slowed things down internally. Then no matter what else happened, I would declare that a success. Did good enough, even if the participants did not respond well to my suggestion, even if it stayed heated. It was not dependent on how they reacted to the way I was showing up. My definition of success was about how I was showing up and whether or not I met these conditions that I determined ahead of time that I could do, that I had control over. And that was a massive weight off of my shoulders going into those workshops, because I really thought out ahead of time what I needed to do to feel good, like I was within my integrity, like I was successful, no matter what actually happened when I stepped in the room. And that made me feel much better about showing up, and also a lot better afterwards. Even if it didn't go really well, I would declare that I did a good job. And that didn't always feel true right away, but it did over time, because I started to really understand this is about how I show up. This is what I have control over. There's so many elements that I don't have control over. And if I link my sense of success or enoughness to all of these other components, I will literally never feel like I'm good enough or succeeding. It has to be defined internally. And having those specific conditions of enoughness allowed me to not get into so much decision fatigue, because all I had to do was hit those 3 marks. And the rest was kind of like, I'm just going to do the best I can and cross my fingers. Does that make sense as a kind of, or how does that relate to your scenario around decision fatigue?
It does. It's given my opinion, hopefully for you, the listener, as well, to think about, to tease out the difference between outcome. Because if I could put some conditions of enoughness around the process of making challenging decisions, and if I met those conditions to make the decision, and I already have some, so I just need to actually more intentionally put conditions of enoughness around that. So, for example, something I learned in antenatal class was to use your brain if you have to make a difficult decision in the birthing process. So, brain being an acronym for benefits, risks, alternatives, instinct, nothing. What happens if you do nothing? And I use that for basically every decision every day that has any kind of weight attached to it. So I could attach a condition of enoughness to say, did you use your brain in this decision? So at least that means that I've considered the benefits, the risks, the alternatives, and 90% of the time I just trust my gut and go with that. It normally steers me right. So it has given me a lot to add to my specific situation, and hopefully for you, the listener, as well. The reason I shared that example then was to hopefully give you a real life practical example of how I might apply something that Jessica has shared today, which I think is important because I'm keen to unpack even more for those listening, to help them get to the stage where they're even brave enough to try to add something like conditions of enoughness to your life. I say brave because if you have been operating as yourself, which you have been, you do the behaviors that you do because they are reinforced. Otherwise, you would not do them. So when you listen to this podcast episode and when you listen to Jessica talk about conditions of enoughness, we're kind of saying, and I can even remove the kind of, we're saying, ignore the reinforcement history for those behaviors that you normally do, which are to protect you, to criticize yourself and say it didn't do well enough. Remove the reinforcers from there. You have a lifetime of history for doing that behavior. Ignore that. Do this new behavior with no reinforcement history and trust the process. That is brave and hard. So when I say wanting to unpack this even more, to say, how did you get, because I don't think everyone is there. I think that can be, your biology might disallow you to do that, right?
Yeah, that's a really good point. Yeah.
How do you even get to the stage where you're brave enough to just today, after listening to this episode, give this a go?
So I would start by choosing something that doesn't feel risky. Like, what is the safest part of your life you could try this with? This is the exact same advice I would give if you're struggling with boundaries. Like, you don't go for the hardest boundary first, right? Like, the hardest boundary is like with your difficult relationship with your mother or work. That's not where you set your very first boundary ever. You set it with like something very low risk around like what television show you want to watch with your partner, right? Something where it feels safe to assert yourself. And it's the same thing with conditions of enoughness. What feels safe for you? And by safe, I mean like your nervous system, like what is helping, what feels maybe challenging, but you still feel regulated, and you can take this little challenging step to set conditions for yourself. So it might be around, something at home in your personal life, and you can practice that way. The other part that's helpful, I think, is, maybe that's less practical, but I think is helpful to keep in mind is those other behaviors are that constant worry and focus on outcome and all the things that we can't control. Those are really good ways to survive, but that's not a way that we want to live. And so conditions of enoughness are about like living the kind of life where you feel literally that life is worth living, that you're doing more than just surviving. You're enjoying your life, or you feel, compassionate with yourself, that you feel like you're behaving from integrity. not just reactive to circumstances. And so I would say that there is reinforcement in this. It's just maybe not, it's not a jackpot reinforcement, but there is, you know, a kindness to ourselves. I always think of conditions of enoughness is like kissing cousins or tied to self-compassion. So we're doing something really hard. The work is overwhelming. It's complicated. They're big feelings. We never feel like we're enough. We feel inadequate. We set these conditions so that we can feel enough and that we don't burn out. But feeling like we're enough is also about treating ourselves with compassion and kindness instead of riding ourselves so hard to be perfect and get it right every time and change the world every time we leave the house. This is about really relating to ourselves with some kindness, the way that we relate to animals most of the time. And that is absolutely positive reinforcement when you, instead of beating yourself up for not being perfect, for failing, when you set these conditions of enoughness, when you are kind to yourself, when you're struggling, it changes the way you relate to yourself so that when you are struggling, you can depend on yourself to be a good friend to yourself in that moment. And that is positive reinforcement to keep going, to keep trying instead of beating yourself up, instead of yelling at a dog, instead of yelling at yourself and criticizing yourself. You're offering yourself some kindness, some sense of success or being good enough. And ultimately, like, that does feel different. You're setting different internal conditions for yourself that I do think are reinforcing. It's just not always really obvious. It's often very challenging in the beginning, but knowing that you're going to be kind to yourself when things don't go well, when you make a mistake and you're learning, that makes it easier for you to keep learning and make mistakes because you won't beat yourself up in it. Does that make sense? I think there is reinforcement and there's a generosity of spirit in conditions of enoughness and self-compassion that is, I think, does help you to be more brave because you know that you are on your own side and you're not going to harm yourself.
I think your answer was a very animal training answer. Is set yourself up for success,
nice.
and find a context where the behavior is going to be easier to perform. Maybe it's not choosing the next Netflix program to watch with your partner. Everyone's different, but maybe it is. And I think that I agree with you totally. And maybe you don't even start with conditions of enoughness if that's too hard.
Definitely.
Maybe you start with something else where you have to do a new behavior in a new context and trust that it's okay, whatever happens. The outcome is not important. What's important is that how you've showed up.
Yeah. Because that's ultimately what you have control over. It's not that the outcomes aren't important. It's just recognizing that you're only one part of the outcome. So you can't take responsibility all on your shoulders for making that outcome happen. You can do the best, most perfect work ever, and still the outcome with your client will not be what you worked for, not because you're bad at the work or inadequate, but just because you're not that powerful. Right? And that's important, I think, to understand that it's the process that you have a lot of power over. It's how you're responding to all the other parts of the job. And yes, we're still working to make a difference. We're working to get a positive outcome. We just hold that outcome a little bit more lightly, understanding that, yeah, that we're just not that powerful. It's not all up to us as an individual or our efforts or skill level to make these outcomes happen. We didn't create it solely. We can't fix it solely. And so again, that's that kind of like process focused and compassion for yourself that it is hard and painful often to not be able to control the outcome of our efforts.
I'm going to try and sum up this episode.
Good luck. I'm very excited to hear how you sum it up because I have no idea what we're talking about.
The outcome of me summing it up is not my measure of success. The fact
It's the
that I
process of this conversation.
try to succinctly communicate the problem and a solution to our audience is the measure of my success.
Agreed.
So,
I think.
the listeners of this show, that's you, our great animal trainers who want to really grow their skills, their knowledge, their confidence in animal training using the most positive, least intrusive methods so that ultimately they can have their biggest possible positive impact on the lives of all the animal and human learners they work. The problem is we all have empathy. We all operate within organizational structures that are not perfect because they can't be, and they have inefficiencies, and we have to operate in that space. And this can be really stressful. It can be overwhelming. It can be frustrating. It can lead to burnout, defined as a syndrome conceptualized as resulting from chronic workplace stress that has not been successfully managed. It is categorized by 3 dimensions: feelings of energy depletion or exhaustion, increased mental distance from one's job, reduced professional efficacy. I actually opened up the website. I did not memorize that. And makes you think, are you good enough to do this job? Should I even be doing this job? We here at Animal Training Academy, and I feel confident speaking on behalf of Jessica here, do not want you to think that. Unless you're in a toxic workplace and you really have to get out of that space. But for a lot of situations, we don't want you to feel the stress, feel the overwhelm. We don't want you to burn out. We need you in this positive training community. Luckily, Jessica, she's been there. You heard about it in episode 1. She spent decades educating and working in this field and developing her knowledge and her skills. And she's brought some really great ideas to you today. One of them is to define success for yourself by how you show up and how you operate rather than the outcome and the things that you don't have control over. So just have a look at how and where you are pulling your measures of success from. The second thing you can do is to, the terminology's not coming to me quickly here.
Conditions of enoughness.
Conditions of enoughness. So define for yourself a couple of things that if you achieve these conditions, then you have been successful. So for Jessica, in her presentation example, it was practicing beforehand, naming stressful situations when they occurred, and taking a moment to breathe and do other exercises to help calm the system, the body down, take a moment, get some oxygen flowing, get the blood back into the brain, help us think better. So if Jessica did those things, they were her example of conditions of enoughness. We do not want you, the listener, feeling stressed, overwhelmed, and we do not want you burning out. We want you to operate successfully and efficiently so that you can have your biggest possible positive impact on all the animals and humans. That was my summary.
I think it was really well done. Did we say all that? That's great. So can I tie together the 2 episodes when I'm thinking about your listeners who might be feeling like they're on the road to burnout or they're dealing with empathy fatigue? I think, in order to not burn out, you have to have time to recover. You have to be able to rest, and you have to feel a sense like you are good enough and you're making an impact at your job. And so going back to that recovery bit, it's really helpful to be able to feel like you have succeeded enough so you can feel safe enough to set boundaries so you can have the time that you need to have a hobby, right? And so they are all linked, right? When we feel this overwhelming sense of responsibility, we feel guilty all the time, it drives overwork and perfectionism. And so we don't set boundaries, we don't take time for ourselves. And then we're also tied into these really unrealistic ideas of success. And so it is all kind of linked together. And so I'm not saying any of this is easy, but this is a game of kind of looking at, how can I start to set some limits or boundaries around the way that I'm working? so that I have time to recover. And one of those ways I think that we get to setting boundaries is by feeling like we did enough. So it is okay for me to set a limit with work. If we never feel like we do enough, if we never feel like we succeed, if we feel like we have to be perfect and take responsibility for everything and everyone, it's never going to feel okay or safe enough for us to set a limit or boundary with work so that we have a life outside of work. So then we're always depleted. We become really resentful. We lose our empathy, right? We start to get really negative and cynical and exhausted. And so they are all really tied together. And so it's not easy, this kind of stuff. So you start really small. What is the safest boundary you can set? What is the way that you can get 5 minutes back in your day for you, right? Go to the bathroom by yourself, everybody. We start, but often we need to look at how we are defining success. Whose definition are we living by? Is it working for us? Who does it benefit if that's our definition of success? And how can we redefine it so that our life is worth living and not just about getting by every day, right?
Yeah.
So it's all really connected, everything that we talked about. How's that for a summary?
Well, I think it's powerful because when you say, how can we redefine it so our life is worth living? For some in our industry, especially in the vet industry, we all know it isn't worth living. So I hear you say that, and I release that on our platform with all seriousness.
Yeah, feeling good enough is a really important part of reducing our suffering in this world and in the work that we're doing. And ultimately, that's the goal, right? That we suffer less, so we stick around.
Well, thank you so much for sharing everything in the last 2 episodes, Jess. Just before we officially wrap up for these 2 episodes, can you just remind everyone where they can go to learn more, to find your websites and get in touch if they want to reach out?
Yeah, you can find me at jessicadolce.com. And if you want to hear from me, you can sign up from my newsletter. You can also find more about the organizational work that I do at compassioninbalance.com. And yeah, that's the best way to be in touch and find me.
Oh, fantastic. We will, of course, link to all of this in the show notes. This has been, and it's been serious topics that I can imagine for some of the listeners potentially a bit stressful or overwhelming to listen to. But this has been fun regardless. Even though we're talking about serious stuff, and I don't mean to diminish the seriousness of the topics we've been talking about by saying that, but it's been a great joy talking to you, Jessica, and learning from you. So from myself and on behalf of everyone listening, we really appreciate you taking the time to come on our Animal Training Academy podcast show. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Ryan.
And thank you as well so much for listening. This is your host, Ryan Cartledge, signing off from this episode of the Animal Training Academy podcast show. It's our hope today's conversation sparked inspiration and added some tools to your trainer's toolbox. Remember, every training challenge is an approximation towards becoming a better trainer. Embrace the rough patches, learn from them, and keep improving. And don't forget, the path to growing your skills and expanding your knowledge continues beyond this episode. Visit www.atamember.com to join our waitlist and be the first to know when our membership doors open again. There you'll find a supportive community of trainers just like you, working to make a positive difference in the lives of animals and humans alike. Until next time, keep honing your skills, stay resilient, and remember, every interaction with an animal or human learner is your opportunity to create ripples. We're here cheering you on every step of the way. See you at the next episode.